Um, so we're going to get started right away. I'm going to turn it over to Rebecca, who is our Vice President of Institutional Advancement. Rebecca, tell us what we're doing here. Oh,
Greg, I'm having a funny phone issue, computer issue. Could you take it away for a second?
I am more than happy to. Let me just get into the notes. So, thank you everyone for joining us. This is the third in our series of discussions that we're having about our response to a life-shaking pandemic and our cry for racial justice. We've been working hard to make the connection between the work that we're doing at Jubilee and the pathway to greater justice more tangible. We believe that housing is the foundation of equity, that disparities would improve if everyone had access to safe, stable, and affordable housing. And our model is a piece of the puzzle, but that to create the larger systemic change that we need to do a lot more. So there's a lot that we have planned to talk about. We're going to talk about what education looks like across the city, the impact of school choice, how housing intersects with education. We invite you to post questions in the chat as we go, and we'll answer them as we can or get to them after the breakout sessions. After our panel conversation, we'll do a breakout so we can talk about what we've just heard and see if anything resonates or if there's anything that we need to discuss more deeply. And then we'll return to the larger group, talk about it all together, see what your highlights were, and be happy to answer any more questions. And then we'll talk about next steps. Where do we go from here? During this session, we hope that you'll be inspired to take action in your own community. That's what this is about, talking about where the challenges are, what we can do to move forward, and then doing that together. So, Jim, do you want to kick us off?
Absolutely. Thank you for framing that up for us, Greg. First of all, I'd like to thank each of you for choosing to join us today. Your time is one of the most valuable commodities that you have, and we really hope that this experience proves to be valuable for you. My first job is to introduce you to our fine panelists. I would say our all-star panelists. The first is Jubilee's own Audrey Walker, who directs our youth services programming. Hello, Audrey. Thank you for joining us. And the second is Maya Martin Cadogen, who is the founder and executive director of Parents Amplifying Voices in Education. Some of you may know them as PAVE. So I'm going to start it off with Maya and say, those of us who were able to review the materials that we circulated last week, where we live and what our housing is like is just super connected with academic performance. So let's start there, Maya. Talk to us about where we see the disparities most in school performance.
Absolutely. And thank you, Jim, and the entire team for having me here today. And so I put up on the screen a PowerPoint slide that we like to share with our families about what academic performance by ward in DC schools looks like. And as you can see, it's inequitable, right? So our current state test is the Parcc Test, and that's the test that we chose as a state for ESSA. And only 15% of our kids in Ward 8 are scoring at or above grade level. And so that's level 4 or level 5. And we know that Ward 8 is the community where we also have the highest amount of poverty in the city, that we have the least access to transportation, where we have high numbers of families who are unemployed and that are being disproportionately impacted by the virus. And then we look at Ward 3, and you're looking at 68% of the students are performing at a 4 or a 5 on the same Parcc Test. And those are in our public schools, both DCPS and public charter. And so a lot of times when we talk about housing, it's layered over together with that data about where people live. And so we know that Ward 3 has the lowest amount of affordable housing, but the highest price homes in the city, and the highest number of white families in the city and the lowest number of Black or brown families. And so a lot of times people are choosing neighborhoods and choosing where to live, and it's correlated with the schools as well and what performance looks like. And that's not because our kids cannot achieve, but it is because investments and the ways in which we make sure to give every kid what they need and the expectations that we make and the kinds of programs that those schools get look different based upon the ward and community that families live in. And so I think it's really important for us to understand that context in a city where we have a lot of school choice. But is it really choice if a lot of that is already being determined by where people choose to live and the kinds of policies that we put together as a city in terms of where we are putting affordable housing for our families to be able to access all parts of our city and all of our schools? And so I think that's something that, I really wanted to highlight, Jim, in terms of that disparity, is that that disparity that we see that you all are addressing at Jubilee with families around housing, we see the same thing in schools at PAVE. And we hear that from families in terms of their lack of access to the kinds of quality education that they need in order for their kids to succeed in career and college.
Maya, as a former teacher, I'm not surprised by these disparities, but what's the one main thing or two main things that might be driving these disparities?
Yeah, so part of it is about our investments in our schools. And so one of the things that I think is really important to know is that if you can see the next slide, can you see the slide that says some parents supplement school budgets?
No, we need you to click on it. Perfect.
So on that slide, one of the things that you'll see is that at a number of our schools, and these are some schools that are in Ward 3, so Janney Elementary, Key Elementary, Mann Elementary. Janney is actually one of the PTAs that collects the highest amount of additional dollars in our country, not even just in our city. So their PTA is raising, as of 2014, $1.4 million in PTA funding that is coming in directly from families. And so part of what you have is a different kind of investment around funding. And so even though we have common funding across all of our schools, this isn't a huge additional amount of funding that's going into our schools that are in different parts of the city. We tried to rectify that as a city by putting together at-risk funding for students who are in schools that are serving students who are majority low income, but that actually follows the child. But one of the things that they found is that most of that money is not actually going to our schools and to our kids. A lot of that funding is and it's not adequate. And that's going to central office, and it's not adequate because we didn't make it adequate. The mayor's own study set what that adequacy amount should be, and we are currently funding our schools for at-risk students $1,000 less per child than what the mayor's own study said. And so a lot of this has to do with investments, and that we're not making those same kinds of investments in our schools that we should be in order to drive equity. And that's the same thing we know about our housing. We're not investing equitably and making sure that people have access to the housing that they need. And so all of these pieces are correlated. As a policy student, you always know correlation doesn't equal causation, but the connectivity of these issues and the divestment that we've had in our communities really does flow between housing and between education. And so I know, Jim, that you have a personal experience with some of the ways that school budgets are supplemented in our schools.
I do, and as you were describing that the per pupil allocations and the differences in the different schools and wards, I was feeling it intensely. We'll make the point later, or you will, that some people have the ability to choose where they live, and my wife and I were able to move to get closer to the elementary school where my daughter would attend. And we were at our opening night, first of the year, first day we were in the school, and we're out in the auditorium lined up in chairs, and we're looking at the big stage, and the principal has given such a lovely vision for the school and what it's about. And then she points behind her to reams of people lined up, and she says, now this part of my team is the DCPS funded team. They're paid for by the city. I'm going to ask them to sit down. And when they did that, about something like half of the people sat down and the other half stayed up. And she said, you know who these are? These are the support staff that the PTO dollars pay for. And I was just blown away in that physical moment to see how much added support that families' contributions made, knowing that so many of the residents who live in Jubilee, for instance, don't have those extra dollars to contribute to their schools.
Absolutely. And I think one of the things that's really interesting, talking to that piece that you're saying, Jim, in terms of people making choices, there was a study done by the DC Policy Center, and the highest correlation that they could find to in-boundary school participation rates was actually feeder pattern. And it was specifically about one feeder pattern that we have in our city in Ward 3, and that's to Wilson High School. And so what they found is that the participation in in-boundary schools, so that's going to a school in your neighborhood, goes up by 24 percentage points, just if you're in an elementary school that feeds into Wilson. And once you're in a middle school that feeds into Wilson, it goes up by 34 points. So what you see on this graph here is that people are making choices about where they live and what schools they want their children to go to, and those are closely connected and intertwined. People are not just choosing the community that they want to live in for where the property of their house is, what kind of land it has. They're also choosing it for what kind of school it has. And so that's a really important conversation that we need to have, which becomes even more important because unfortunately, we're segregated by income and by race. And so when you look at this map of DC with DC's 8 wards laid out, and you look on the left-hand side where under 1% of affordable housing exists, whether or not that's Section 8, multifamily, housing choice vouchers, inclusionary zoning, the Housing Protection Trust Fund, which the mayor has invested heavily in. The lowest numbers of affordable housing are in Ward 3 and somewhat in Ward 2. And yet when you look on the other side, where more than half, or 20 to 50% of our housing is affordable, you're looking almost entirely at 7 and 8. So essentially, by policy and by choice, we are concentrating poverty, and we're not creating equity between our schools or between our communities. And so it's really important for us to have those kinds of conversations about how we're funding and how we're creating equity between our kids. And I think what we all know is that we would love to see that diversity in our schools if we were actually going to achieve the kind of world that many of our civil rights leaders fought for. And so a really interesting study by DC Policy Center, I love to show this one because where that star is where we should be. That's where all of our schools should be centered. Those should be schools that are socioeconomically and racially diverse. And yet when you look at this map, what it's showing us is that the majority of our schools are racially segregated in our city, or they are socioeconomically segregated. And that's a problem. And that's leading to the inequity that we then have inside of our schools around what the results for kids look like and what the funding looks like for our children. And so, I think those are really important conversations for us to have in terms of how are we offering schools the flexibility to have the kind of funding that they need in that diversity and making sure that it meets their needs in all regards, because our families are not just integrating in schools, they're also integrating in all parts of our community. And so I'd love to pass it over to Jim just to talk about how you see this at Jubilee coming together between academic performance and housing.
Thank you, Maya. Guys, if you've done this with us the last couple of weeks, we spent a little bit of time setting up the painful data. And so it's important to understand what's wrong with the picture before we are really in position to solve and get to solutions. I think, Maya, you've made the point already that educational outcomes are so highly correlated with where we live. I think what we're going to try to do now is start to move into what some of the attempted solutions are. And Audrey, I'm going to cue you up a little bit to start the conversation about school choice.
So let's talk about school choice. We spend a lot of time on our end, trying to help families understand their choices and the way the public, charter, and private school system works in DC. The lottery system was created to enhance access, but it's clearly not enough. Maya, why do you think that is?
In part, it's because our lottery system, and I'm really proud that I was actually one of the people that helped to create the DC lottery, because what we had before my school DC was even more inequitable, where families had to navigate all of these choices in our city. We have 66 different school districts inside of DC. That's DCPS and 65 public charter networks. But one of the things that's really difficult for quite a few families is that most of those most in-demand seats are already taken by siblings. And in DCPS, they're taken by in-boundary preference. And so that's why that Wilson High School slide really matters, because those families mean that as long as people are coming through the in-boundary process, it leaves fewer seats open for people who are coming from out of boundary. And that is a lot of our DCPS schools. And then on the other side, you have sibling preference, which means that if one's brother or sister gets in, the other one gets in. And so oftentimes that's a good thing for families in that they don't have to travel far to drop different kids at different schools. But then you're exacerbating inequity, because what that means is that at-risk students have a harder time getting into schools that have siblings that are already enrolled. And so that's a real conversation that we need to think about and have as a city. And I see a good question from George about the funding, which I just want to make sure to quickly address. DC does spend a high amount per pupil, but the problem with the way our per pupil funding looks is that the cost of living in our city is one of the highest in the country. And so while we're technically funding a lot, some of that amount per pupil is not actually even going to kids. It's going to capital projects. It's going to technology and operations. And so it's not actually going into the classrooms. And then when you're talking about what goes into the classrooms, the highest cost that all schools have, whether or not you're charter or DCPS, is your salaries. And because salaries are expensive in this region, what you're talking about is then that makes less space and less room for kids to get the other kinds of services that we need, that know they need to succeed. And so I want to make sure that we understand that a lot of people like to put that number up, and while true, it has to be understood in context in order to know the inequity that we have in the system.
Yeah, it's definitely not an understood system, all these systems. I would like to provide a little bit of background, like a little bit about my experience with the lottery. I have 2 children, and even though I was somewhat satisfied with their schools, I knew there were better schools in DC that I could send my children to. So every year I would put my bid into the lottery. Some years, very discouraged, was waitlisted. Other years, I was able to get my daughter into Key Elementary School, one of the schools that was listed, because of their higher performance in math and reading. That's where I wanted her to go. So I've had some successes. I haven't had some successes. But from what I'm hearing from our families, the lottery is just not reliable. You just don't know what you're going to get. You don't know if there'll be sibling preference. So the lottery is not as reliable, and it can be discouraging if you enter year after year. Also, educating our families about school choice is really, really important. A lot of families don't know that there's choice in private school, public school, charter schools, homeschooling, online, virtual. All these options, a lot of families don't know. So we try to integrate it into our youth services program that we're educating our families. But as a parent myself, I've tried to apply for my children to go to private schools, and there are a lot of loopholes that you have to go through. First, you have to pay for the application. Then you have to get your kid there for a day program. And then the kid has to take the PSSAT, which is like the SAT for kids. And then, it's just like they're sizing children up, I feel like. And so it's a lot of barriers. A lot of families don't speak the same language. And so it's really important, an integral part of our program, to really educate and help our families navigate that process and bring in partners that can help our families do so.
Thank you for that, Audrey. Guys, I'm going to try to make one last comment about this access issue. And then we're going to spend our last few minutes before we go to break talking about the importance of after-school programming. So there's a parallel here between the challenges that students face in the educational system in DC and the challenges that families face in accessing housing. And so societally, through various programs, federal and local, we've tried to break the access barrier. One of the ways we do that in housing is we have the Housing Choice Voucher program, used to be Section 8. You get your voucher, you're able to take that to whatever neighborhood you want to and live in a neighborhood that has more resources and attend a school that is higher performing. And that actually works really well for that family, the family who has the voucher. And we've talked to many of you at length about Raj Chetty's studies about how zip code is the highest predictor of future success. So it works for that family, but what about all the other families that didn't get that voucher? And so what you're seeing here with a similarity with the lottery access to school is there are a handful of families each year that get the magic ticket and their child gets to go to the school that has more resources and is higher performing. And so that's good for that family. But this is not a systemic solution. And the challenges, the equity challenges that face our communities are much bigger than being solved one or two families at a time. So we've got to continue to push for new solutions that really create access. And if you're a Jubilee friend, you know that my next statement is going to be, that's why we're so committed to justice housing as a model that locates deeply affordable housing in neighborhoods that are high opportunity, resource rich, which includes good schools. So we're going to keep plugging that as part of the solution to this larger challenge. And now I want to tee Audrey up to talk a little bit more about out of school time programming. This is our last subject before we break out into small groups. And I'll start with a did you know? For years, it is proven that people who attend after school programming have higher attendance rates at school, which leads to higher persistence rates at school, ta-da, which leads to higher graduation rates at school. So kids going to after school programming is a very good thing. But tell us a little bit more about why, Audrey.
All right. Yes. I have two kids in the background, so excuse any type of interference. So the value of OSC programs is one, it provides a safe, supportive space for children to come after school. It allows our families to work. Our programs are extended through 7 p.m. Also provides kids with healthy meals and academic enrichment and activities. So in the face of COVID, we've definitely found that it's even more important that we provide that service, of course, virtually, since we have not been able to have contact with our students since March. So through spring and summer, we definitely adapted our in-person programming to an online virtual program to ensure that students were able to navigate their virtual learning. We also wanted to make sure we were doing wellness checks with our families just to make sure they had all of their vital resources. And then we also created a grab and go meal centralized site in Jubilee where students can come and get lunch and snacks throughout the week. And then also our virtual programming, which consisted of our after school components in a virtual platform. So next week, and we also definitely want to maintain our students' social emotional development. That's so important, actually on top of the academic piece at this point, because our students have been going through, and families have been going through so many changes in their lives, making sure that their social emotional stability is intact and supporting them in any way that we can. So next week, we plan to open up our centers as learning hubs to small groups of students 2 times a week, where students can come in, one, of course, have a safe place, have a structured place so they can participate in their virtual learning during the school day, have access to really good, strong Wi-Fi, and also provide just a few days out of the week so their parents can go to work and earn income. I mean, that's a really huge problem. I'm also facing that now. I'm blessed to have a job, but it's a challenge to kind of work and also support your child virtually. So we are hopeful that our learning hubs will kind of take some of the stress and pressure off of our families to have to figure out every single thing. And so we hope that our program will make up for those limitations. Right now, we will operate in phases. We'll open up on October 5th and we'll run through November 6th. And then we will evaluate where our programs are, where the DC Department of Health, what are their guidelines for our programs to be open, and what DC Public School decides moving forward after November 6th.
Whoops, I've got the mute problem. Sorry about that. That is pretty much going to round up our presentation for you, gang. We're going to get you off into a small group breakout session here in a second. I'm going to give you some instructions on how to spend some of that time. We will have some Q&A when we come back. And Greg, I may have jumped in on you there. Do you want a minute of that first, or are we going to go straight to groups?
Let's go straight to groups.
Okay. So you're going to have about 10, 12 minutes in a small group of 4 or 5 together. We're going to ask you to begin the introduction together by talking about you a little bit. So we have a very focused question. Do you remember when you were growing up, whenever you were in your elementary and middle school and high school years, what degree of integration your school had? Were you one of many different kinds of people who looked differently, or were you one of everyone looked the same? What stood out to you about one or two of those years in your childhood? So in 2 or 3 sentences, I'm going to say, my name is Jim. I grew up in a school. I remember this one school situation. Go around the horn, let everybody do that. And then we'll open it up more generally. Did anything that you heard from Maya or Audrey provoke your interest? Anything that you really resonated for you? Anything that you disagreed with that you want to take us on with? What stood out to you? You'll have a minute or two to sort of process together, and then we'll return to the big group. We'll have a chance to report out anything significant from the small group, and we'll have a chance for a few last questions from Maya and Audrey.
Hey, welcome back, everybody. I think this is everybody. So I hope you had a great discussion. I know my group did. I want to open up this time to hear what came up in your breakout groups. What struck everybody? What were some things that really resonated with you in the panel discussion that you got to talk about? Was there something new that you realized? If you can just type it in the chat, or if you want to unmute yourself and just speak it out, I really want to hear. Okay, we can also take questions. If anybody has questions.
I will just share a little bit, Greg, that I came from a place where I had worked for 13 years, and it was, an education for low income, mid-tier students. And so, I know the importance of this, and I've seen the miracles when you have an organization that can support these kids and provide them with the tools and the skills and the information that they need, that they can succeed in high school and then on into not necessarily always a college, but a secondary type of school, a skills school or something like that. I've witnessed a million miracles to see what kids are capable of doing when they have the right support.
Amen. Well said, Lori.
Yep.
Thank you.
Hey, Greg, can I invite Tanya to say a little bit more about her question? She is an educator in our community. Tanya, can you explain what you're thinking a little more?
Yes, I'm sorry. Attending a martial arts class with a little boy that I tutor right now, so forgive the noise in the background. Anyway, I was wondering why, one of the reasons I was very interested in signing up for this meeting is because I noticed that when you are a voucher recipient or you are living in a subsidized housing unit, you are limited to how much further education you can receive. Personally, I would like to continue and gain more education to better my opportunities, and I'm not allowed to do that. So I was wondering why that is, and it seems like systemic racism because, folks are kept behind as opposed to being allowed to achieve and accomplish higher heights and receive better opportunities by gaining education. But that's if you can't go to school full time, you can't attend certain kinds of school, and I was wondering why that is.
Thank you, Tanya. I think I follow your question. So some of you may or may not be aware that the low-income housing tax credit program, which funds the most affordable housing across the country, has a very clear prohibition about being a full-time college student as the leaseholder on the lease. That does create unintended consequences. That was created to prevent people who have plenty of means financially from using this scarce affordable housing to get through college. it had the intention of making sure the housing reached people who had the incomes that best fit it. But it is a sort of a heavy requirement. And if a family is in that situation, if the leaseholder, the primary leaseholder is in that situation and wants to be a full-time student, that creates compliance issues. So I would chalk that up as an unintended consequence of, social programming. And Tanya would love to talk with you offline about whether there are any ways we could creatively support your goals. There may be some wiggle room in that.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Yeah, Maya, I think this next one is probably for you. Patricia had a question. Despite increasing recognition of systemic racism, what will it take to disband exclusionary zoning rules? Actually, that might be a housing one. Is that housing or is that education?
Housing.
Well, thank you for the question. Zoning and land planning is increasingly understood as one of the levers that drives the way that neighborhoods are going to look over time. Decisions about density, about types of uses of land really do go a long way to deciding what a neighborhood will look like. Some of the Ward 3 neighborhoods that have the least affordable housing also have zoning limitations that limit the land to single family homes. And so when you have a low density single family home neighborhood, you can't put in an apartment building, for instance. And so it's not as economically viable to build an apartment building there. Not sure if you want to say anything more, Patricia, about a specific kind of exclusionary practice, but I follow a theologian who does his work in the Ivy League these days, Willie Jennings, who says as a pastor, he cares more about where his congregants are at zoning meetings than he does about Sunday in the church pew. That more important decisions are being made in those meetings than we'll ever make in the church room. So land use is critical. If you live in the district, you actually have some voice here. We're in the process of completing what's called our comprehensive plan. And I won't go deeper than that, but Marty Mellett can tell you more about it if you'd like to follow up with him. As citizens, we have an opportunity to comment on the city's comprehensive plan, and it very much decides where the high density housing will be, where the uses are that are more conducive to social services and other kinds of supports. So would very much invite you to be active in that space. You can go to your ANC meetings if you're a DC resident and ask about the comp plan and get an avenue there. So let me leave it there for now.
And I'll just add, in the non-DC area, the exclusionary rules often are, they will create zones where it's a 4 or 5 acre lot. So that's the other way they do it. So, it just makes it such that you have to build this big. And that's, other jurisdictions are trying to figure out how to do that. We don't have to do that as much because we're not in farmland or outside of, but it is an issue.
Yeah, I'm glad we're talking about next steps because that's actually the next step in this. Where do we go from here? So we have one more in this series of conversations that we've been doing. We're going to talk about housing and reentry for people who are coming back home from incarceration on October 14th. So if you've not signed up for that session, please join us. That's also going to be really fruitful. On October 22nd, we're going to have building on the foundation. We've been talking about these big picture ideas around wealth building, health, education, and reentry. And October 22nd at 8 p.m., we're going to talk about what Jubilee is specifically doing to bring justice through housing. If this is firing you up and you want to get involved and you want to start doing something at this policy level, please contact Marty Mellett. He's our VP of External Affairs. His email is right here. We would love to get you on a committee helping us talk about expanded access for affordable housing, expanded funding for the same, more resources for out of school time, and more resources for returning citizens and the reentry process.
And Greg, let's give Maya one more chunk of time, short chunk of time to talk about how her advocacy works.
I was, absolutely.
Not bad.
Just want to get through the one last one. So just on that one more point, getting involved locally is, of course, the best thing that we can do. We stress this every time. There are so many decisions that are made at a much smaller level than most of us realize, whether that's land use or zoning or what public resources are shared or created in our neighborhoods. We need people to say yes in my backyard, YIMBY, not no in my backyard. There are lots of loud negative voices on listservs and Facebook groups and Google groups. We need loud, positive voices. So Maya, please, your organization is so involved in advocacy. Tell us a little bit more about what DC PAVE is doing.
Absolutely. So a little bit about us. So our parents actually do the work to advocate for a lot of these changes that we're talking about here today around education. So they fight for per pupil funding, for at-risk funding, for increased funding for mental health and trauma-informed training and social emotional programs in schools. And DC this past summer, when we did the pandemic budget, we were the only state in the country to increase our funding for kids. And that was in large part because our parent leaders met over 60 times during the pandemic while they were doing virtual learning in order to talk with their policymakers and elected officials and identify what solutions they wanted to see for our system. But the fight's not over. Our budgets have been greatly impacted by the pandemic, and so we want to make sure that we keep that focus on equity. And so our parents write their own statements of belief, they create their own advocacy campaigns, and then they get to work making them happen. And so we'd love for anyone who wants to join us. The majority of our parents are from Ward 7 and 8. They are majority Black and brown, but we'd love for anyone to join us in that advocacy and that work. I'm sharing in the chat their statement and their work around DC schools recovery, so you can take a look at that. And they think about all of the inputs, even budget transparency, the OST funding that was quadrupled 2 years ago, what came from PAVE Parent Leaders Advocacy, along with a number of different organizations, including Jubilee, who joined us in that battle. And so parents are able to do amazing things because they are the constituents of all these people that we're trying to get to make different decisions around what our city looks like. So Patricia, if I could say that there is any one thing that can change this, it's people. And so we've got to get everybody engaged and fighting together to create the city that we want to see in our future, which might not be the city that we have right now, but it is a city we can build for our kids. And so I would invite everyone to join with us and with our parent leaders in making that possible.
Okay, all right. That wraps this up. Are there any last minute burning questions, comments, concerns, feelings, inspirations? You all, thank you so much. We so appreciate everybody coming and being a part of this with us. I hope it was fruitful, and I look forward to talking with you about this more as we go forward.
Thanks,
Thank
everyone.
you.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.
Very helpful.
Thank you very much for allowing this platform to be. Thank you, Jim. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
For being here, Tanya. Hey, Pat. How are you, Pat?
Hi, Pat.
You're muted, Pat.
Thank you for being here, Jamie.
Bye, Pat. Nice to see you. I don't know if you can hear me.